Welcome to the Times of Israel's What Matters Now, a weekly podcast delving into one issue facing Israel and the Jewish world right now. I'm your host, Deputy Editor Amanda Borschel-Dan, here with Ahmed Fouad Alkhatib. Thank you so much for joining me again, Ahmed.
Thanks for talking to me. It's always a pleasure.
The pleasure is mine, and we all know that, so let's stop pretending. But before we dive in, I just want to refresh our listeners' memory about you. And you grew up in Gaza, but left the Strip in 2005 as a teenager to go study in the U.S. as a high school pupil. And you have not been inside the Strip since, but you did fly over it this summer, which I'm going to ask you about. You head up the Realign For Palestine, which is an Atlantic Council project that challenges entrenched narratives in the Israel and Palestine discourse. I have a lot of questions for you, Ahmed, about life in Gaza right now and, of course, the rerouting of Hamas in Gaza. But first of all, I do want to ask you about the flyover this summer, where you were part of an aid drop, a United Arab Emirates aid drop, and saw your home for the first time in, 20 years, right?
Precisely. That was quite a mission. I was really grateful to the United Arab Emirates for allowing me to take part in actually what turned out to be the last 2 days of airdrops that have occurred over the Gaza Strip. And so it was flying 2 successive missions 2 days in a row. And I really wanted to both see Gaza from above, survey the damage, connect with the place, get a sense of what's really unfolding on the ground. But also, um, I wanted to kind of prove a point, if you will, which is that the airdrops were an example of when you acknowledge and address Israel's legitimate security concerns when it comes to aid, when it comes to access to Gaza, virtually nothing is impossible. Nothing is off limits. And so when you have a trusted third party, Gaza's airspace over the past year and a half, if you will, of the war went from being under the sole domain of the Israeli Air Force to having the air forces of multiple nations carrying out airdrops in coordination with the Israeli Air Force. And so to me, I wanted to prove and experience and feel and see what it's like to have Gaza's airspace be open for business, if you will, because that's going to be key for Gaza's recovery and long-term rejuvenation. And so it was both an emotional journey, but one that to me was very fruitful conceptually as far as proving that you can work with Israel in a radically pragmatic sense and fashion to achieve a lot. And that's one of the philosophical underpinnings, if you will, of Realign For Palestine, the initiative at the Atlantic Council, is the embrace of radical pragmatism instead of radical extremism and violence or ideological frameworks. Radical pragmatism is the understanding the art of what's possible, what's achievable, what's obtainable, and assessing that even if there are political or ideological disagreements, there's always room and capacity for cooperation. And so I was really grateful for that opportunity.
Okay, so I have to ask before we go to break, how did it feel to see your home of 20 years ago under you?
I'll be honest with you, I, throughout this war, have had to engage in a great deal of emotional blunting to sort of numb a lot of the feelings and emotions. Not because I'm emotionless, far from it. I've always considered myself a deeply emotional and an emotionally intelligent human being. At the same time, to keep myself going and to really sustain my efforts, I have to create barriers, particularly after the loss of family members, after the loss of our childhood homes, and just seeing my native homeland being decimated. by the Israeli military, and certainly by the actions of Hamas and what it unleashed on October 7th. Um, th- so there was an element of emotional blunting that I had to do to stay focused on the mission while flying over Gaza. But some of that was extraordinarily difficult to do. It was, so in other words, that's a long-winded way of saying it was deeply emotional. And yet I managed to stay focused. I managed to offer commentary. I managed to capture footage. And I'll be frank and honest with you and share that I was actually given instructions that were delivered by the Israeli authorities not to film the devastation and not to film the destruction. And I made a choice for myself on my own to disregard that because I did not feel that that was a reasonable request. And I was not there to be an agitator. I was there to merely offer commentary, capture what had happened to my homeland, and also capture what was going on with the mission itself. And so I very much so viewed that as a kind of as a historic responsibility of mine to chronicle what was really below me. And so thankfully nothing nothing became of that and it didn't cause any issues with between the Emiratis of Israel. As a matter of fact, the video went viral within Israel and certainly in Arab media. And so my intention was to highlight the role of the United Arab Emirates, show Gaza's airspace as being open for business, capture my homeland. And it was a deeply emotional yet highly rewarding experience.
So I'm going to put a link to an article that we wrote about that in the program notes. So let's go to a short break and then we'll discuss what's happening now in Gaza.
I was worried, or I still am, about Mandani because it was interesting. I was following this, of course, and here's the guy, a young man who's running on a platform of affordable housing and free buses and community grocery shops. And it's not that he's interested in geopolitics. He didn't speak about women's rights in Iran. He didn't speak about the Uyghurs in China. He didn't speak about the hunger in Sudan, by the way, a much larger tragedy than the one occurred here in Israel and Gaza. But he was really, really persistent about talking about what is happening in Israel. So it's not that he's a humanitarian or somebody who's really preoccupied with geopolitical problems. He was just focused on us, and therefore we have a name for people who are focused on the Jews and what the Jews are doing. And therefore I was worried about the fact that he was elected and about the way he was campaigning about Israel and the Jews.
And we're back. I'm Deputy Editor Amanda Borschel-Dan here with Ahmed Fouad Alkhatib. So Ahmed, of course, everyone is watching with dismay with the apparent rerouting of Hamas into the Gaza Strip. To remind our listeners, of course, Israel controls, shall we say, 53% of the Gaza Strip, but Hamas's 47% is the majority of the population. And so the question is always, do you think, Ahmed, that right now Hamas has popular support from the Gazan people to reroute and take up the reins of power again?
So the short answer to what is a deeply interconnected, interwoven dynamic is absolutely not. Hamas is deeply unpopular in Gaza. However, there are two pieces that are one that is kind of well known, and the other one is a bit more ironic. So the first one that's well known is that Hamas is torturing and beating the absolute crap out of everybody in Gaza who dares challenge their authority. And one of the things that is most disturbing, one of the things that is most horrifying is how out in the open. Gaza's three main hospitals, Al Shifa in Gaza City, Al Aqsa in Deir al Balah, and Nasser in Khan Yunis, have become major torture, interrogation, and prison centers for Hamas. They have become dungeons, they have become gulags, they have become synonymous, particularly certain segments, even certain sections, certain centers of them. I've had a friend of mine who was put in a cage with 8 other people, covered with a bunch of blankets in this cage, and hearing equipment and machines and beeping heart monitors. Sadistic, fascistic, Nazi level, like Mengele stuff that's happening, whereby right now, the threat is if you open your mouth, Hamas will like that's literally the literal translation. If you say anything against Hamas, they'll put rods in your legs. And what that means is they'll break your legs and then they'll put rods in there. So you're disabled for life. And so, yes, when this is common knowledge, when this is street knowledge, when this is something that my friend who was tortured and gave me a video of Hamas raiding their tent and the family's tent and beating the heck out of their sisters to arrest him, and said, release this video if I'm dead or if I get killed. This is not a society that's in love with Hamas. And these are all people who...
Is this new so much? I mean, obviously, we heard the tales from the hostages when they returned of the torture that they underwent in these same hospitals, right? So it's not as if it was repurposed right now for the Gazan people. It was already in action during the war. Did it not predate the war as well, that these hospitals were Hamas centers and torture chambers?
This is totally new. This was never the case before the war. Absolutely not. This is a new trend, but also what remains of Hamas are a bunch of, you can say, battle-hardened, unpaid, barely paid, gang of criminals and thugs, essentially. And there's no structure, there's no cohesion, there was no Hamas the government, Hamas the movement, Hamas the this. It's all been commingled. And so the Iraq, and truth be said, there were elements of Hamas before the war that were what you would say are decent people, that were not fascistic in the sense they were always part of a fascistic ideology, but they weren't all mass torturers and all kidnappers and all beaters. You know what I mean? There were bureaucrats. There were people who were like, but now Hamas and their enforcers, particularly some of the younger people, because a lot of their fighters have been killed. A lot of the younger people, they're not really trained. They're inexperienced. They just pay them. They just give them money and guns and just cut them loose, essentially. So that's part one of the answer to your question is no. Hamas has enforced a level of horror and terror upon the society.
Let me sharpen this just slightly, if you don't mind. It sounds to me like what you're saying is that before the war, Hamas was much more of a pseudo-government, if we want to call it that. It had its own military, which had its own ranks and training and discipline. And right now, after the war, after Israel took most of the upper echelon of its leadership, including most of the upper echelon of the bureaucrats, it sounds as if Hamas has descended into becoming more of a gang, basically more of the terrorist organization that I think much of the world would have considered it prior to the war. in the war, the onslaught, the October 7th, 2023 onslaught, which surprised Israel also because of the discipline, the ranking, the amazing military strategy that Hamas performed to make this operation successful. But right now, we're at gang level, and we're talking about street kids who are joining up and are getting guns and basically food and joining this gang that is called Hamas in order to terrorize and survive, essentially. But do you have any idea of the numbers of people who are with Hamas right now in this role, in this gang iteration?
Well, so the quantification has been a challenge. Though I've spoken to security experts, external ones, and some have cast doubt on the 7,000 number. I mean, I've seen claims of 20,000, which I don't buy for a second. And that's based on my own assessment that I didn't follow a scientific method to reach this conclusion. We've seen reports of the roughly 7,000 number. However, I've spoken to some security officials, American and Israelis, who are real professionals when it comes to this and are coming at it from a dispassionate point of view. And they estimate it's closer to perhaps 2,500 to 3,000, who are the ones out in the Gaza Strip, in the so-called red zone, who are patrolling, who are controlling the different areas and neighborhoods. The interesting thing, though, is I consume, dozens and dozens of videos from Gaza every day from people. I go on very obscure channels on Facebook and Twitter and whatever, just to see people uploading themselves walking in Gaza, and some of those landmarks and streets I know very, very well from having grown up there, and just in general. You get to know Gaza after a while. And Hamas is really invisible. For the most part. What you see of Hamas right now are a bunch of those Toyota Hilux pickup trucks and some Mitsubishi pickup trucks, and they're just roaming around in patrols. You'll see them see like a few 3 to 6 members at big intersections. Usually they're wearing a mask with their AKs. They don't even look like they have spare magazines, AK magazines or clips. They used to have 1 or 2 magazines on them. So they're not even necessarily ready for an extended firefight. They're just there to project presence, to deter, and to say, we are here. Hamas exists. But let me go to the other. So just to be clear, just to finish the first thought, is that if you take the fact that people are beaten and tired and they've lost their homes and they've lost their livelihoods, they've lost their hope, there's long lines. Yesterday I was talking to a friend of mine who lost all of her family, her mom and dad, and she now lives in a tent, and she has 4 children, and she's divorced. And the plight of divorced Gaza women is horrendous because of the social stigma and trying to survive on your own. And she had mentioned that her 16-year-old child was on a long line to a bathroom, and she urinated herself because she couldn't hold it anymore. Those are not people that are going to say, oh my God, Hamas is wonderful. Oh my God, like October 7. So that is the majority of the people of Gaza. And by the way, as a tangent, you've seen how Twitter has revealed all of these pro-Hamas, pro-Palestine fascist accounts to be mainly from Qatar, Turkey, Pakistan, Yemen. None of them are from Gaza, okay? People in Gaza can't stand Hamas. So then there's another component to this, which this is the failure of the so-called peace plan, of the ceasefire. This is the essence when you hear people say there's a security vacuum. We didn't give any alternative to Hamas, etc. So I've been talking to several friends, guys, and I have a few, like I was talking to this friend of mine who is let's just call her a leading feminist activist. And Gaza women, by the way, are an important target audience to speak with because their lived experience gives you an additional layers of hardships, both in terms of the war and the suffering, but also in terms of the society and what's going on internally. And so you really get a good synthesis that is no nonsense, in my opinion, of speaking to those folks. And so she was telling me how she was like, yeah, I started putting on makeup again and like going out and like going to do little women group thingies, talking to women in displaced thingies and just helping them with one in displaced centers and areas and whatever. I was like, oh, I mean, good for you. Like put that. But the reason why I'm not being tongue in cheek here, but the reason I was like, oh, so you're out in the street again, huh? She's like, yeah, dude, the security situation internally has gotten much better. And so long story short, what began as a crackdown on gangsters, on looters, on the hamulas, on the families that were supposedly collaborating with the IDF in Israel, even though most of them really did not. That was total BS. That was Hamas trying to impose its violence. That extended a little bit into fighting crime, and what that ultimately had is a deterrence effect that basically there were three things happen. Any criminal of any grade, Hamas would just take, break their legs, break their arms, beat the crap, throw stones at them, like very barbaric medieval level torture. So people were like, oh my God, that's terrible. Hamas chased out criminals from certain areas. And then finally, there was just a deterrence effect where even people with guns, they're like, all right, I'm going to just put my guns here and they're just going to be hidden and I'm going to just be a nice citizen. So Hamas did restore law and order internally. That doesn't mean there's zero crime in Gaza. But what I'm trying to say is this is what it means to not have any alternative to Hamas. And so this feminist activist of mine, as you can imagine, is deeply, deeply anti-Hamas. And she's like, and we have security. Like, women feel particularly vulnerable in those settings. And a lot of times if something bad happens to you, you can't open up your mouth because of the societal pressure, etc. So that is the other side of how to interpret what might to the outside world appear to be Gazans' silence and acquiescence to Hamas, is that after 2 years of war, after 2 years of devastation and death and destruction and hunger and this and this and this and rack, all the different horrors. When the ceasefire was declared, people were like, oh God, now we have to do we have to become like Mogadishu? We have to become like Somalia? We have to become like parts of Syria and Iraq? And Hamas, through their fascistic Nazi-level horror, was able to very quickly establish a monopoly on force. Does that mean people love Hamas? No. If you provide an alternative that can provide security and safety, people will jettison Hamas in a heartbeat. But in the absence of that now, coming up on 2 months after the ceasefire, what are Gazans supposed to do?
Right. In an abusive relationship, which obviously is the case between Hamas and the Gazan people, you go back to that relationship if you have nothing else to go towards. So the question that many people are asking is there a way to provide some kind of sense of security, perhaps even on the Israeli side, across the yellow line in the 53% that Israel controls, to create these kind of bubbles, a sanctuary for some of the Gazans, and create this kind of ripple effect or a domino effect where some come over, some have some sort of trust or hope in the IDF or in Israel or in partnership with Trump and the stabilization force and all the different players that are coming into the Gaza Strip apparently from January. Is there any way that some Gazans would be able to have that leap of faith, as it were, to go into the IDF side and try and start life again?
Well, so real quickly, I mean, some of that, there's a perception that the IDF was behind some of those right or wrong. And there's evidence to support the possibility that maybe there was there's a kernel of truth to some of those claims, but there's a perception that the IDF and Israel were behind some of these criminal and destabilizing forces in Gaza, that ultimately led to some of the problematic trends and behaviors we saw. So there needs to be kind of an overcome, and not to mention the 2 years of warfare. But there is a belief that, broadly speaking, um, Israel will not allow, and I'm not saying is necessarily correct, but this is the perception that has to be addressed and overcome to really slowly start draining the life out of Hamas, is that Israel is not really interested in allowing for the emergence of a truly safe and crime-free Gaza or Palestinian enclaves or territories or bubbles. And so something would need to be addressed there to overcome that perception. And perceptions are very, very powerful, even if they're not fully accurate. Number two, there's the issue of, can these forces, the International Stabilization Force, can it, without an organic local detachment or element, can it really have the gravitas to kind of induce trust that can allow people to rally around it? Will those Indonesian and Azerbaijani soldiers or Azeri soldiers be able to go after criminals? Are they going to build jails? So if Hamas was doing barbaric fascistic actions, how are the Azeris and the Indonesians and the Egyptians going to create that same level of deterrence without the kind of horrendous, heavy-handed violence that Hamas perpetrated? So then you go into the next element of, what kind of is it, like, what's the incentive structure in terms of law and order? Is it kind of the I have the guns and I'm the gangster and therefore I rule? Is it international law? Is it local tribal law? Is it law imported from the state of Palestine? And, like, what's going to gradually create from the bottom up this cohesive legal and societal bond that establishes standards of behaviors? Of course, people among themselves know this behavior is bad, this behavior is bad. But I'm saying, like, how are you going to codify conduct in a way that sets a hierarchy of consequences and follow-up actions? So if those things are addressed, And I think there's more than enough possibility for setting up miniaturized examples across the yellow zone. There, I think some of that can absolutely happen, 100%. My only concern is that I am not a proponent of the prolonging of I'm not a proponent of the partition of Gaza or of the prolonging of this idea that we can have two separate Gazans, because that's ultimately what Hamas wants. Hamas will literally rule over a square and just call it Hamasistan. And like, we shouldn't even entertain that and allow them to feel that that is a remote possibility. And so that's what I'm really hoping we can figure out over the next few weeks. But I don't have indications thus far that we're headed to anything remotely close to the aforementioned, and that I worry that we're facing a stalemate and a stagnation, that Hamas and Qatar and Turkey have very much so it's baked in. They've been counting on it to prolong the gap between phase 1 and phase 2, and this creates normalcy bias, that Hamas is an inevitability, when in fact Hamas is not an inevitability. Hamas is weak. Hamas can be defeated. Hamas can absolutely be taken on. Now that they've lost the Israeli hostages, the only thing that remains for Hamas that is a source of power isn't even their tunnels anymore. It's the fact that they control 2 million people. They have 2 million hostages. And so I think beyond the experiment that we discussed just a minute ago, the other good use for the yellow zone, if the resumption of some kind of war is inevitable, is that you set up an actual monitored system of access to evacuate civilians to the yellow zone. But unlike the terrible strategy of the last 2 years of just saying, okay, northern Gaza, go down to the hands of Hamas, and there's going to be humanitarian supplies and aid there, and oh, by the way, and then we're just going to bomb al-Mawasi zone, and we're going to keep doing this because Hamas was hiding in al-Mawasi zone. It's like, no, we're going to actually set up a firewall. We're going to check biometrically through ID, through metal detectors, who's coming in to the yellow zone. Most of them are going to be civilians. But then once they're in the yellow zone, the goal is, and Israel needs to not be bombing the yellow zone and not be bombing the tents and so that it's a truly safe zone. I think Hamas could be truly confronted and eliminated in due time.
Okay, let's go to a short break.
What if prayer doesn't work? This question strikes us as a distinctly modern one, an outgrowth of the slow disenchantment of the world. But in truth, the question is an old one, and one given space to breathe here.
Welcome to Thoughts and Prayers. I'm your host, Jessica Fisher. Join me on a deep exploration of the relationship between religion and modernity through personal stories, classical texts, and conversations with leading rabbis, scholars, and educators.
You're almost not supposed to be doing this interview.
Our prayers accumulate on God's doorstep, piled outside like an unimaginably tall stack of letters. We cannot give up on the relationship because God doesn't come to the door as quickly as we may like. So let's keep knocking. Perhaps the gates of compassion will be opened.
Join us every week on Thoughts and Prayers wherever you get your podcasts.
And we're back. I'm Amanda Borschel-Dan here with Ahmed Fouad Alkhatib. Now, Ahmed, for most of these 2 years on these podcasts that I've been hosting, we've been talking about how Hamas is playing a long game, meaning their ultimate goal is the destruction of Israel, and they're willing to basically destroy most of their population in order to achieve it. That's how we have the tunnel system, and all of above ground in Gaza was their cushion, essentially, their human shield that happens to be, as you said, 2 million people and at one time hostages as well. And so the real question, I think, for many of us is Hamas even remotely going to head towards phase two? When I personally heard these phases, it seemed to me ridiculous that Hamas would at any point demilitarize and set down its arms. And it seemed to me so completely obvious that it was this big bluff in order to regroup, reroute, exactly what we're seeing playing out right now. I just never thought that it would go to phase two. And I thought basically, every single day on the daily briefing, we announced the day of the war. And after the ceasefire, people ask me, why are you still announcing the day of the war? From my perspective, and I'm wrong all the time, just ask my kids, I'm wrong a lot. But from my perspective, we're in a bit of a lull. And it seems to me very clear that within, I don't want to predict how long, but a month, 2 months, we'll be right back at war. Is that your feeling as well at all, Ahmed?
Absolutely. And that breaks my heart. That keeps me up at night. That has me feeling like physically and almost like clinically depressed. I, first of all, I can't, I mean, I commend the efforts of the United States, Mr. Witkoff and Mr. Kushner, to get the hostages out, to end the war and end the suffering. I have never been a proponent of just the way that the Israeli government was carrying out the war was ever. I mean, I've spoken to Israelis, I've spoken to security folks in the United States, I've spoken to some of the biggest names in the United States military, both current and former, and everybody was scratching their head like, what is Israel doing? And we saw some of that come to light with Chief of Staff Eyal Zamir and Netanyahu, and then we kept seeing all the nonsense coming out of the far right ministers who were saying one thing, and then the prime minister would come out and say, well, actually, we're not going to starve people. Well, actually, we're not going to push them into the sea or Sinai. So with all of that said, I think it was a mistake to end the war without like creating these phases. Like you create steps, not phases. And this is something that I had said to some U.S. policymakers behind the scenes as the war was happening. I advocated for a single phase with multiple steps. But this idea and the ending of the war should have by default entailed, for example, Haddad leaving Gaza or surrendering or turning himself over or going to Qatar or going to Turkey or Iran or somewhere. It should have entailed at least a detailed map of all tunnels up to a certain point or up in northern Gaza or some parameters. If they weren't going to give them all up, just some parameters of Gaza. It should have entailed an immediate handing over of all available rockets and mines and IEDs that Hamas had. It should have entailed the immediate deployment of a rapid response force in certain sectors in Gaza to prevent the scenario that I spoken to you about earlier of Hamas being the only one that provides security. Now, you can talk about, well, this is the best we could have had. This was I get it. I get how difficult those things are. But we're not talking about a war that was going on for 2 to 3 months. We're talking about like a 2-year war that has really reshaped global opinion and public opinion around the world and has transcended 2 administrations and all the baggage that came with it. So and this is why the Saudis and the Emiratis right now are very upset. And that's why there's little enthusiasm for them to go into Gaza because there were a lot of concessions given to Qatar with okay, fine, Netanyahu apologized. Okay, that's fair. Okay, for the strike. But then Qatar basically and Turkey were in the driver's seat of this whole situation. And then you have and the air facility in the United States for their Air Force and the defense treaty that they got, etc. So Qatar set the tone, and Qatar was of the belief that Hamas could absolutely be rebranded and remarketed. And so I think, unfortunately, the intentions were well behind the implementation of this, but then you have a hollowed out State Department, you have Kushner and Witkoff with little to no staff, you have no USAID, which didn't just handle aid delivery, it actually did do a lot of transitional planning and a lot of post conflict rehabilitation, a lot of it was the firepower, that the non-military firepower that the United States could deploy. And so with that being gone, with this weird ethos conflict that Trump and the United States, the current administration of the United States has, of, well, we're against nation building and foreign entanglements and foreign wars, and we're not going to get sucked into another Middle Eastern conflict, but we're going to have a leadership role in Gaza, and everybody's looking to us, and everybody really needs us, and we just brokered the ceasefire, and we're going to bring peace to the Middle East. And you look at the CMCC, which is a great idea, except the U.S. is already looking to scale back its leadership role in there, because it wants allies, European and others, to shoulder more of the responsibility and take over, except no one is going to do that. People want the United States to be there, and the U.S. was hoping that the Emiratis and the Saudis would just take it over, and that's not going to happen. They're like, no, with Hamas still being in there, we're no longer just the check writers. Our economies are complex. We're investing. MBS is actually, believe it or not, strapped on cash. They're a lot of their money isn't even liquid, so they can't even write the big marvelous checks that you think they used to. And so, yeah, we're not heading to a great place. The good news, however, is that I think, well, before the good news, I think it's going to dip to a place where it is a mess. It's it's, you're going to need, there's been even discussion of somebody like General Kurilla of CENTCOM, former general head of CENTCOM. You're going to need somebody to take over the CMCC and the newly incoming International Stabilization Force. Somebody needs to address this gap between this force supposedly disarming Hamas and enforcing the peace, and Indonesia and Azerbaijan and everybody else saying, no, we're not going to fight Hamas. We're just going to show up there, have some dudes sit in armored vehicles and say, yay, we have a peacekeeping. So, somebody needs to prevent this from being a UNIFIL 2.0, which is the force in southern Lebanon, because that's actually going to end up protecting Hamas. That's literally going to actually end up getting in between the IDF and Hamas, and that's going to be a disaster. So I predict things will go down to the abyss, and one of two things will happen. And maybe that's a good note to wrap up on, is either, God forbid, but I would assign it a 65% probability, a resumption of the war, because there'll just be a stalemate. Everything will hit a dead end. Trump will lose focus. He'll move on. He'll be in Venezuela. Our economy in the United States is not looking very good. I think we'll have what amounts to a recession in the U.S. in 2026, in my opinion, or some kind of an economic crisis that becomes the sole focus of the current administration rather than foreign policy. And with the upcoming elections in Israel, Lord knows what how the current prime minister will choose to leverage Gaza in that race. So I think there'll be a resumption of war, or the hopeful scenario is somebody like a General Kurilla, or we need somebody like a David Petraeus, or for those of you who are old enough, like a Norman Schwarzkopf in 1990, 91, to like come in. And it's not just about brute force. It's about the leadership, the charisma. I mean, it might not even require active fighting in Gaza. It might literally just be about the precise application of assets, resources, threats, warnings to Hamas with Arab legitimacy, Arab cover, Arab involvement. True multilateralism needs charisma and needs leadership. It is not run out of true multilateralism is not going to come out of something like the CMCC that is headless, that has no figurehead, that's really identifiable, that's like not a household name, that's not a something that rolls off the top of someone's tongue, if you will, a journalist. And so that's where we could see a sparing of Gaza and the actual resumption of the peace deal towards phase 2, in a way that salvages this and puts the Strip on a path toward demilitarization, recovery, rejuvenation, reconstruction. And again, reconstruction alone is not what Gaza needs. This is what Tony Blair spoke about. It needs reconstitution. Gaza, we can't just have UNRWA come back, the UN takes over, billions of dollars get wasted in their UNDP development program takes over. We can't reconstruct all the destroyed refugee camps. This is actually an opportunity to rebuild them as mini towns or as part of Gaza City. So there's an opportunity for an urban renewal, a cultural renaissance, renewal, and a new social contract between the people of Gaza, the transitional authority that's going to govern them, and ultimately the Palestinian polity that will take over. And by the way, just last words, I don't believe that anytime soon that can or should be the Palestinian Authority. And no, I am not necessarily saying this from the Palestinian Authority should have an element of security involved 100%, and the Palestinian Authority needs to help with like the ministries of education, the ministries of health, for example. There's a lot of bureaucratic work that the PA is perfect for, the financial system, but in terms of the ethos, in terms of bringing the Palestinian Authority is like late style Soviet moribund governance. It's like Brezhnev when he was barely alive, coupled with half Saddam Hussein, half Hafez al-Assad regime, Ba'athist regime. That is not a governance model for renewal. So I'll stop here. I hope that was helpful.
Ahmed, it was so helpful. And listeners, we will speak again soon. Ahmed and I will speak again soon because I don't know about you, but I have a lot more questions for Ahmed. And please feel free to drop me an email with questions for him. We're going to try and make this a monthly date, right? So,
Inshallah.
inshallah, exactly. Plenty of time to gather all these questions. I have many thoughts on what you just said, and I'm going to hopefully make them more coherent for our follow-up conversation, which should happen very soon. So thank you so much, Ahmed, for all of your insights today.
Thank you, Amanda. Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening to the Times of Israel's What Matters Now. Please check out another installment next week. This episode was produced by the Podwares. If you have any questions or comments or questions for Ahmed, please drop me an email at podcast@timesofisrael.com. Until next week. Shalom.